Much of the faith that is truly religious is of the same form. It is not the insistence that something superstitious or impossible was true, but the proclamation and definition of what constitutes, comprises, or characterizes the real, and that should therefore be attended to most diligently and acted on. This is irreducibly a decision, not least because we can never know enough ahead of time to be certain, and must move forward with assumption in the face of our ignorance. Marriage offers a helpful analogy. A marriage cannot commence without faith in its permanence. Is the evidence for its permanence there prior to the commitment? No. Furthermore, the evidence that would be necessary cannot be gathered in any manner without the a priori commitment, the vow to play that particular game and none other. All the crucial decisions of life are made on principle, not in consequence of sufficient evidence. That does not mean that we should move forward stupidly and blindly. Whenever we face the truly unknown, however, we are obliged to move forward with faith. The alternative is grim indeed. An excerpt there from Jordan Peterson's "We Who Wrestle with God: Perspectives on the Divine." This was published this year, 2024, by publisher Alan Lane. Now, I did and didn't want to do this review. In fact, I'm actually just recording this video and then I'm going to send it to 3 or 4 close friends of mine to see if it's really appropriate for the channel, because this is just way too close to culture war. Excuse my curse words here. Culture war bullshit for me. But I really feel I have to comment because Rowan Williams has given not necessarily a favourable review, but a review that I still think is unfair for a reason that I'll get to. John Gray, I've just read his review in the New Statesman, and I also have read that the Guardian review, which was a bit more scathing. Now, the reason I think all of these reviews are unfair is because none of them admit to the fact that this book is largely complete and utter gibberish. And I mean that literally. This book is genuine gobbledygook, as you can see from this passage that I just read out. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like a complete insane schizophrenic mess where the words are nonsensical. Sentences are on their own make sense. For instance, in that whole excerpt there, the sentence, "A marriage cannot commence without faith in its permanence," that makes sense and could have been expanded into a good point. But the large bulk of this over 500, I believe 576 page book is genuinely so close to nonsense that the only reason I can think for this being published as it is they've accidentally published the margin notes maybe that Peterson wrote, because this is the worst edited book I've ever read, and it's one of the worst books I've ever read. And not only that, it's borderline heretical in terms of what it's actually trying to defend. Now, the only reason I'm really commenting on this is because as someone who is trying to make long form serious discussions about philosophy and religion and esotericism and spirituality, is that when you see something such as We Who Wrestle with God coming to the fore, being this really popular book that many people are, this will be possibly their first ever entry into supposed biblical scholarship or analysis. There's no Bible scholarship here. Not a single bit of Bible scholarship here at all. The excerpts from the Bible could have been pulled willy-nilly, and I will get to an example of that right at the beginning of the book, actually. I mean, he wastes no time making it clear what he's actually doing. So the frustration for me is this could be many people's first Bible scholar, like book of supposed biblical secondary analysis, or whatever you want to call it. It could also be many people's sort of first introduction to the sort of continuation of Nietzsche post death of God, of what to do with that question. Also very bad on that, but in a weird postmodern way, it actually is doing something sort of post-Heideggerian. I'll also get to that. And Derridian. I mean, Jordan Peterson's my favorite postmodernist, and I will explain why. This book is fantastic in that sense. You could maybe argue that it's the follow-up to A Thousand Plateaus. And it could also be people's first introduction to Jung. So what this is all at once is a self-help, immanentized analysis of the Bible with lukewarm Nietzsche and watered-down Jung thrown in, with the typical Peterson references to Solzhenitsyn, contemporaneous gender politics, and this kind of strange nostalgic view of the feminine, which just reeks throughout the whole thing. Now, I'm not going to mince words on that one, because you might have gathered from that maybe there's parts of the book I like. I did not like this book. It's really, really bad. It's offensively bad. Now, I want to begin literally right at the beginning, okay? And the first chapter of the book is titled "In the Beginning," and if you cut to brass tacks of what this book is supposedly meant to be doing, and Peterson is meant to be doing in this book, he's meant to be going through the Bible and analyzing certain sections as a wrestling with God, and as a means to sort of explain and give meaning to the Bible for, I guess, his usual audience, right? And so, he's meant to be taking sections from the Bible, such as Genesis or whatever it is, and then commenting on them. There's a long tradition of this, of course, of biblical commentary, massively long tradition of this ever since after the life of Christ. So the first, to quote, the first section is called "In the Beginning," and he quotes Genesis 1:1-2. So Genesis 1:1-2, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." So he's taking this section, and this is probably the only time where the section really matters, because the other times he could have just taken any section, it wouldn't have mattered. And you'll see why right now, because immediately after referencing Genesis 1:1-2, this is what he has to say. And it's a somewhat, not massively long excerpt, but this is what he says. "How is God presented as the great book of Genesis begins? As an animated spirit, creative, mobile, and active. Something that does and is." Fine so far. And then this is where we really get to start, and you can immediately see what Peterson is trying to do. And I quote, "God is, in short, a character whose personality reveals itself as the biblical story proceeds. Genesis opens with a confrontation. God is, in quotation marks, moving upon the face of the waters. What does moving mean? It means God is mobile, obviously. Less obviously, moving is what we say when we have been struck by something deep. God is what has encountered us when new possibilities emerge and take shape. God is what we encounter when we are moved to the depths. What, then, does waters mean? Particularly the waters that God has not yet created." And on it goes, right? So my problem here is, does he want to write a book about basically what is self-help and personality, and things that, help us do all those typical Peterson type things of, overcoming strife and etc., etc. Go watch any of his just boring lectures and you will find those things. But immediately what Peterson is doing is engaging in three philosophical currents that are absolutely counter to his rather banal, I know he doesn't like being called a conservative, he defines as a classical liberal, but three intellectual philosophical currents that are counter to his entire project, okay? Firstly, he is immanentizing the eschaton in a strange sense. Go read Eric Vogelin about the idea of immanentizing the eschaton, or listen to my interview with Michael Federici about Eric Vogelin. The concept of immanentizing the eschaton is the notion of bringing down, very, very, very more abstractly, but bringing down the end times as to achieve a utopia here on earth. And so what is Peterson doing in this first current? He is bringing God down. To quote Peterson, God is, in short, a character whose personality reveals itself as the biblical story proceeds. Immediately, the second sentence of Jordan Peterson's book, he immanentizes God down to the level of a lukewarm, Jungian boring idea of God is just this this somewhat flattened, immanentized representation of a human being and can be seen as a character. So immediately, he is not engaging with what the Bible purports to be, which is, divinely inspired scripture as given literally from God. He immediately reduces God down and immanentizes him. And this is what he does across all myths, across all spiritual stories. He reduces them down to a struggle of singular individual human personality within a very specific context of modern day individualism, of basically trying to be successful. Okay, that's all he does. So first current there is that. The second current that he's engaging with then is actually, though none of his fans, even though he did that garish and awful kitsch song trying to take the mick out of him, realize that Jordan Peterson is possibly the best postmodernist after Derrida. He is engaging immediately, whether he wants to admit to it or not, in Derridian deconstruction. Okay, first thing he does is not to take anything in terms of the value that is any of the the basic values that you'd think that a classical liberal or a conservative or a believer would stand for, such as truth, beauty, goodness. These aren't values that pre-exist for Jordan Peterson as they would given from God as this creative spirit that he is then talking about. These are things that in that Derridian sense can only exist in a relational linguistic context. And so any sentence that Jordan Peterson engages with, he basically can't even talk, because as soon as he's saying, he's read the the line, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and he's going, what does moving mean? What does waters mean? And like everything is a definition. And this is ultimately what is happening in postmodernism writ large. And he purports to understand postmodernism, but he just doesn't understand it at all. I mean, and it's not even that difficult to understand in that very boring sense that most people understand it, which is in part a fair reading of postmodernism, which comes from Frederick Jameson, this idea of deconstructing the large value signifiers of saying, well, there's no such thing as truth. There's no, what is beauty, and deconstructing these things. And Peterson basically engages in this in a specifically Derridian sense by taking every single sort of key term. It's like a Derridian deconstruction in minutiae of basically engaging in that form of deconstruction. That a concept can only be understood in the context either of its opposite or relational, or so the words waters and moving can only really be understood in this whole, but then each part is also deconstructed as part of that whole. And so the second thing, and he's always engaging in deconstruction, by the way, the thing that Jordan Peterson is always doing is asking, what does something mean? What does faith mean? What does it mean to believe in God? What does blah blah blah? Constantly engaging in the notion of whether or not something means something and deconstructing it in that manner, in the same manner that he deconstructs God as a character. He immediately draws him down and then begins to deconstruct God into basically a bunch of linguistic parts. That is the second current that Jordan Peterson shoves himself into without even realizing it. The third one is a bit of a stretch on my part, but I do believe it's there, which is actually he is engaging in if we consider the work of Martin Heidegger post-Nietzsche in the sense of Death of God, Nietzsche is engaging with a sort of post-Nietzschean, Peterson is engaging with that, with this post-Heideggerian God reduced to a language game. In this infamous interview, Heidegger says, only a God can save us. The only possibility available to us is that by thinking and poeticizing, we prepare readiness for the appearance of a God or for the absence of a God in our decline. Insofar as in view of the absent God, we are in a state of decline. And it's this poeticizing, this strangeness of the Heideggerian God that Heidegger has taken from Nietzsche, the death of God, and taken Nietzsche's points about philology. Maybe if I take a few steps back there, I will state that, but to really begin this Nietzschean current, Peterson, in engaging with the postmodern questions of what does waters mean? So, to go back up to how he literally starts the book, Peterson begins with questions which ultimately are of philology. He believes that he is writing a book that is meant to be tackling the question of Nietzsche, right? So, for those of you that aren't as familiar with philosophy, I will back up a little bit here. The ultimate question, I think, if we can sincerely say with any seriousness that Jordan Peterson is engaging with any question at all in his Randian, silly, largely narcissistic and egotistical quest to save the West, is he's engaging with the question of the death of God and what to do after the death of God. Now, the undergraduate understanding of the death of God, and I think it's a fine understanding of the death of God, would be very quickly replace the word God with Christendom, and you can see really what that statement from Beyond Good and Evil and from Thus Spoke Zarathustra and other places means, which is that it's the death of overarching moral structures, the death of a guiding force, a guiding light, a guiding God, whatever it might be, the death of that within culture. There are, of course, other theological symptoms that arise from the notion of the death of God, the mortalization of God, etc., etc. But the point isn't specifically to do with any kind of new atheism. The point isn't that we don't believe because we've somehow worked out that God isn't real. It's that we can no longer believe. We exist in such a state post the death of God that we can no longer believe in God. And Peterson, if he's engaging with anything, is engaging with this question. But in engaging with this question, in starting his book with God is moving and upon the face of the waters. What does moving mean? What does waters mean? He doesn't even realize that he is engaging with the question that Nietzsche engaged with, which drew him away from his initial faith, which was philological problems. That the language of the Bible is basically, very roughly, the language of the Bible is so distant, so far away from us, that philologically speaking, we just cannot understand what this text is trying to say to us. Right? This is all fairly abstract and rough, and I'm not going to bring up sources, so look into these things yourself. But this is, the Nietzsche philological response to God is that you can't engage with this language at such a distance. And Peterson is beginning to engage with the exact same question, but instead of engaging with a Nietzschean response, which is to basically craft new values, which is equally, by the way, a Derridian response. In solely linguistic terms, Derrida would say that deconstruction, to be effective, deconstruction needs to create new terms. It can't synthesize from the pre-existing terms, where they're only defined from their relations. These contexts and concepts of opposition and relation, that Derrida would say we need to create new terms, but etc., etc., marking out difference and creating new terms and creating this interplay, which is also somewhat related to the hermeneutic circle, which I'll get to. Nietzsche would also say the exact same thing in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and I would hope that Peterson would know this, that beyond this, we have to overcome by creating new values. And Peterson is constantly just caught in this game of basically getting off on nostalgia, but knowing Nietzsche enough to not be drawn either way, and he's caught in like 10 different binds all at once. So he's caught in this problem of postmodernism. He is a postmodernist. He always wants to try and define the meaning of something without just giving himself over to what we might call a classical or traditional response, where there are these given values. His whole edifice, his whole project is reliant on truth, beauty, wisdom, success, value itself as basically concepts which are ultimately true, but at the same time he's constantly undermining them by, in this quest, questioning what they are and why we should go for them altogether. And so before he's even begun wrestling with God, he's completely drawn God down and undermined God to to, as I said, the a personal character, what he calls a character. He calls God a character, which is sort of basically a psychoanalytical term. Um, and, so in that sense, probably the first thing any good editor could do with Peterson's book is go through, Control F every single mention of the word God, and lower the capital G to a lower G, because it's not who Peterson is talking about it. Ironically, Peterson is not taking the Bible on faith at all. He is applying a method of reading it which is emphatically postmodern. Now, that sounds like I'm trying to have a fancy reread of what he's doing. Not at all. That is what he's doing. He just doesn't realize it. But equally, he's doing that in such a bad manner. Let me just read. I'll give you another excerpt. There was a few I picked out, and I'm not cherry picking them. I'm not cherry picking these at all. You could randomly flick to any page of We Who Wrestle with God and basically almost suffer a brain hemorrhage from how bad this writing is. These are run-on sentences that are up there with the works of Thomas Pynchon. This is one thing that in the reviews that I read in the mainstream press, you could read between the lines and see that people would say, oh, it's a bit wordy, or maybe it needed a bit of an editor. If you're seeing that in something like The Guardian or whatever it might be, or The Telegraph, there's problems, and I will be the one to say this is badly written to a degree that I can't imagine a serious publisher actually reading this and letting it out as it is. Okay, so another excerpt here. No man who avows disbelief in free will or even in consciousness itself dares to treat his wife as if she lacks free will or consciousness. Why not? Because all hell breaks loose if he does. And why is that? Because the presumption of intrinsic value reflects a reality that is deep enough, real enough, so that we deny it at our practical peril. And if that presumption is so absolutely necessary, how is it not true? And if the presumption that structures our every interaction is acceptance of or dramatization of the transcendent value of the individual, even ourselves, then in what manner do we not believe that value to be real? More profoundly, we may ask, at what point must it be admitted that a necessary fiction is true precisely in proportion to its necessity? So, firstly, I apologize. There's probably a little bit of me being a bit excited that isn't reading that as well as I could. So I apologize. Fair dues or whatever where it's considered, but it's badly written. Also, at the end there, we have another nice nod to postmodernism, which is this is a fantastic sentence from Peterson here, which is almost like, is he playing a game? Listen to this. At what point must it be admitted that a, in quotation marks, necessary fiction is true precisely in proportion to its necessity? Now, that question, in minutiae, is quite literally the question of the death of God, and he doesn't even realize he's asking that, which is the question of, it's a Pascalian question after the death of God, which is to live as if God exists, the necessary fiction. But you're writing a book about an analysis of the Bible which purports to be a serious analysis of the Bible, an analysis of the Christian God, a biblical commentary to help people understand the Bible and grow in that typical Peterson way. And yet you're constantly and ceaselessly admitting to the fact of the question of the necessary postmodern fiction of to live as if. Now, there's a struggle here, because the bind, of course, then is, these are all questions that have been tackled already. We who wrestle with God, people have been doing that since basically once Jesus appeared once again, and then people began to wrestle with that question. The whole new atheist, and then counter that, the other movement which is going on with the revival, second religiosity of Christianity. This isn't the first time these questions have been asked, and there's a deep annoyance that it comes across that way. Anyway, the necessary fiction, the postmodernism, it's and just to jump back again, just in terms of the style, in terms of the writing, the bad writing, it reads as if maybe a relatively bad first draft of, okay, these are things that I want to make sure I get in this section, and then you go back and reorder it so that it's has a hierarchy and has a structure that builds to something. This is line after line of basically detached or just largely incoherent point that just don't really ever seem to cohere. So on this notion that I mentioned there of the questions already being answered, I'll give an example of what I mean by that from the book. So this is 2.1, the image of God in the eternal garden. And this is a bit of a longer excerpt, but I will... Okay, so this is John Peterson. In Genesis 1, a series of narrative propositions emerge that existence is the consequence of an eternal, transcendent spirit acting upon potential itself, that the habitable order that is good emerges from the workings of that spirit, that man and woman are made in the likeness of that spirit, and that this spirit is what has proper and eternal dominion over creation. Genesis 1 insists that man and woman are veritable images of God. Such an image is not God, precisely, but a low-resolution sampling of the original. Something of the same nature in many ways, on a lesser, more restricted scale. Something that is kenotic, emptied in relationship to the original. Something that is an icon or even avatar of the original. These presumptions are echoed very soon thereafter in Genesis 2, a chapter that offers a more deeply embodied primal portrayal. This is quoting Genesis 2:7. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living soul. This is back to Peterson. Is the idea of man as an image of God not utterly preposterous? How could flawed man, even the lowliest man or woman, possess a direct relationship to the divine? Man, with his propensity for decrepitude, suffering, and death, his self-evident insignificance contrasted with nature and the cosmos, the brevity of his life. Why attribute value to something so fleeting in its existence and contemptible in its inadequacy? But in the absence of that divine proposition, where would we be? So he's trying to tackle these things, but man with his propensity for decrepitude, suffering, and death. Well, that's answered within Genesis by the exit from Eden, which Peterson does, of course, get to at a certain point. But in reading the Bible in this sense, you're beginning to answer questions that are answered, a few passages later in the Bible. But there's also this strange, is the idea of man as an image of God not utterly preposterous? Question mark. Well, Jordan, I thought this was going to be a defense. Equally, we have this idea of such an image is not God precisely, but a low-resolution sampling of the original. Sort of a strange way of understanding the man as the image of God. And when we finally get through to his reading, so all of this sort of guff and definition games, eventually, usually if there is any culmination in this book of what Peterson is really trying to get at, it's usually a rather pithy and boring, typically Peterson-esque lesson about how to guide your character in a very contemporaneous and banal ethical sense to do with picking up a rock, right? So this is about, so we've had this man being loved by God, man being given value in the universe. What a preposterous thing that man, this lowly creature with death and suffering, which anyone who's read the Bible understands because that's from the fall. Pretty key thing. Anyway, of course, I don't want to be too mean about that because he does deal with it. But anyway, this is from the sections dealing with sin, etc. Imagine that your life is progressing well. You dwell in an orderly, beautiful garden, optimally balanced between structure and possibility. But you have neither incorporated nor conquered all things. You have established a conceptual structure, but a fringe remains, that which, or indeed those who do not fit the ordered pattern and are marginalized. Yeah, a nice little political nod there. Should the order be restructured so that all those who do not fit can now be included? This is not simply managed. A veritable multitude of forms lurk on the margin. No multiplicity can be made the center of a unity, and there is no perception, much less stability or hope in the absence of a unity. All is too much. This is talking about the Garden of Eden here. to quote Peterson, inclusion of the margin means entropy overwhelms order, and if the margin is not sufficient to overwhelm, the margin of the margin will most definitely suffice. Every fringe has its more extreme fringe. And then on to Eve's temptation. Eve falls prey to temptation and consorts with the serpent. That serpent is both what is marginal, even monstrous, as the snake is a truly and genuinely poisonous agent, and the eternal temptation of pride, the pride that wishes to usurp or take the place of God. We can imagine the serpent's approach, whispering, "Embrace me and take to yourself the prerogative of the divine mastery over the moral order itself, definition of good and evil itself." Right, so there's just so much in here, which, like, once again, my reading is a bit quick tonight because I kind of just wanted to get this done and make my main comment, which will really come at the end. My main comment, if you want to click off the video and move on, is this is my just before I do some really just basic analysis of this section. My main comment, just as someone and also knowing a lot of people in the sphere. Of people who are trying to introduce people to concepts and ideas, and figures such as Jung and figures such as Nietzsche, right? In a serious way, is that what rises to the top is just lazy. This is just lazy scholarship, and there's strange popular appeal that readings and commentaries and rereadings of things are absolutely legitimate, right? That's been done since time immemorial, but it's eschewing something to such a degree that your own reading begins very quickly usurps and rises higher than the original thing, and then starts to use it. And this is what Peterson does throughout the whole book, is basically he uses Christ, he uses the Bible, and he uses God. He immanentizes God down to this level of lukewarm, watered down, undergraduate understanding of Jung and Nietzsche, and then uses that absolutely pithy self-help soup to bolster his pseudo-conservative, boring views. And so we see here in this strange comments about the marginalized, imagine that your life is progressing well, which is a strange thing to say about Eden in the first place. But this is what happens when you immanentize the Bible down to the level of the human, is all of a sudden like, oh, we're just chilling out in the literal garden. Yeah, my life's going pretty good. Well, you're not really engaging with the question of the Garden of Eden, which is perfection. And so the notion of your life progressing well in Eden doesn't really make any sense. You dwell in an orderly, typically Peterson type thing there, order and chaos, blah, blah, blah. You dwell in an orderly, beautiful garden, optimally balanced between structure and possibility. Of course, the very notion of there being a possibility, etc., is questionable concerning the notion of Eden being perfection with God. The idea that there would be a possibility in that case doesn't really make any sense, but I don't want to go into criticizing his theological understanding, which is bad. But you have neither incorporated nor conquered all things. So you're in the Garden of Eden and you're wanting to conquer everything. That doesn't really make any sense either. But then basically using all of this, immanentizing everything, as I've said. So here's the process that he goes through to just basically be able to abuse and use God for his own aims, which is immanentize God down to a character, which he can then use, deconstruct linguistically and philologically the language that's within it, so that he can then redefine things to basically for his own aims. And then this, which is then he then begins, and he says, you have established a conceptual structure, but a fringe remains. A fringe remains on the Garden of Eden, apparently. That which, or indeed those who do not fit the ordered pattern and are marginalized. And so, sort of drum roll and hit the snare. Finally, we've got to the point that he's trying to make, which is that basically a very banal conservative point, that the marginalized just shouldn't be allowed in Eden. That is all I'm really taking from this passage, and I've read it a few times, and I've got a bit of a headache from doing so. Inclusion of the margin means entropy overwhelms order. Fine, make your really banal, old hat political assessments. Do that elsewhere, but don't do that in relation to the Garden of Eden if you profess to seriously be commenting on the Bible. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And so, I think there's this great sentence, really. I mean, and this is legit. This is actually the sentence. This is 1.3. In this book, the We Who Wrestle with God, the real and its representation. This is to quote the great Jordan Peterson: "What could possibly be more real than the facts? First, which facts? And there indeed is the rub." He says that. What could possibly be more real than facts? Okay. First, which facts? I love that, because what could possibly be more real than the facts? Oh, he's a traditionalist. He's a traditionalist. Maybe he's a Platonist. We've got the Platonic forms. What could be more real than facts? Of course, we've got, what could possibly be more real than the facts? Oh, of course, he's talking about the facts. He's talking about tradition. He's talking about beauty. He's talking about value. He's talking about love. He's talking about morals. He's talking about good and the bad. Beautiful. I'm with him. If you're a Petersonian, you're with him at this point. But then the next sentence, first, which fact? Immediately straight into postmodernism. And then he follows it up with this weird casualness. And there indeed is the rub. And of course, then he goes off into a whole boatload of nonsense. So look, this isn't a review. This isn't actually me trying to engage in the culture war. It's not even me trying to be too cruel to Peterson himself. I think, as I've said to many people, there is this exact place for what Jordan Peterson is doing that had a legitimate question and a sad answer that was very quickly avoided. The question back in 2016, 17, when Peterson was rising as a sort of commentator, the question to be had was, why did so many young men and many young women as well sympathize with what Peterson had to say, considering it was often very, very basic advice, such as, pick up a rock, pick up a weight, value yourself, stand up straight with your shoulders back. And the sad answer to that was that there hadn't been much guidance for many young people, and he stood in ultimately as a paternal father figure for many of these people. And within that sort of zone, with a rather undergraduate form of self-help and motivation, absolutely fine, but it just exploded out of its bounds into a 570 whatever page book of biblical analysis, which is just largely just complete nonsense. And so what has risen to the top of what is counted as philosophy, what is counted now as theology, what is counted as spiritual analysis, isn't just lazy, isn't just bad, but is arguably word salad entertainment. And it's not a case of me wanting to gatekeep things. It's not a case of me wanting to say, oh, you should have known your Nietzsche, and you should have known your Heidegger, and you should have, you should have gone and read Derrida and blah, blah, blah. Not that an introductory book to any of those would really be that taxing, right? I think there's a lot to be said for treating people with respect and saying, no, you can work this out for yourself. What's frustrating is that he purports to be this very learned figure who is giving courses on this without really engaging with anything beyond your early undergraduate seminars, just taking a very quick idea and then rolling with it. So it's this problem of very quickly understanding the death of God or Jungian archetypes or whatever it might be on a very superficial level, and then immediately taking this gigantic leap to the realm of idiosyncratic reading, where it's like, well, hang on, you've missed a ton of context with these things. And that, alongside the fact that the book itself is very, very bad and arguably just a lot of nonsense, it's deeply frustrating for anyone who is trying to engage with ideas and philosophy, and also that personal quest of spirituality in any serious sense, is that your first introduction to Nietzsche, Jung, and often the Bible isn't really right, isn't really correct, because it's so steeped in what is basically a lukewarm, watered down, contemporaneous form of nostalgic American conservatism that you're never going to retrieve whatever was the original seed of anything that was there in the first place. And, I would just say to one of those people, if you're interested in these things, go pick up the actual books. They're not that difficult. That's the great lie. You don't need this kind of TED Talk lectures on these. And also, you don't have to be interested in this stuff. That's one of the problems is in transforming it into entertainment becomes its own thing. So, yeah, this is... where I would say Peterson is at the end of this, at the end of what his project is here, is ironically what is known throughout many thinkers, but is a key part of the work of Martin Heidegger, who I've mentioned, who is probably the most important sort of post-Nietzschean death of God, like dealing with the death of God figure. One of the very, very important ones is the notion of the hermeneutic circle. That our understanding, not just of a text, but our understanding of phenomena, our engagement of the world, with a certain lean to the Nietzschean idea of eternal recurrence, is that the circle itself begets a greater and greater understanding. And instead of really beginning what I would, sort of mutate this metaphor a bit of this increased understanding, this circle of hermeneutics, is that instead of beginning from the position of the death of God, Peterson is engaging with what Spengler called the second religiosity, and his circle of engagement is really caught between points in time and is constantly re-engaging with a nostalgic form which is long since gone. And the whole thing ends up very convoluted. And if you then turn that circle, he's also stuck on two sides in the sense of he is a man of this time with, rigorous scientific method, with postmodern critique and analysis, with deconstruction, that has all become very much a part and parcel of the way that we think, very much part and parcel of common forms of thinking. But he's also constantly also caught in that nostalgic form of arguably Plato the ideas with truth forms, and he's constantly revolving in all these ways and caught between them that ends up in a massive, basically just a confused mess. And I will repeat, it's not really me wanting to be mean. It's just an annoyance that firstly, that the reason I even did this whole thing, whether or not I post this, we'll see. The reason I did this whole thing is actually because I saw the other reviews, and I found that the reviews from John Gray, from Rowan Williams, John Gray's work I like. I haven't read any of. I know who Rowan Williams is, and I've listened to his couple of talks, whatever. The reason in content, whatever they had to say, it's clear they both had to veer so far from the reality of this book that they were just trying to be polite. I personally feel that way. And so there was annoyance for me that because of, that notion of too big to fail, that you look at the reviews on Goodreads and people are saying things like, oh, the profoundness of this book. And one of the comments that I've seen about 3 or 4 times in different quick reviews, Amazon and Goodreads, is, this is a book I'll definitely have to reread many times. Some of these passages I've had to go back and reread 2 or 3 times because they're so deep. No, you've had to go back and reread them because they don't make any sense. They're actually nonsensical. And so I think some of these reviews are just people having to basically, in almost like a Deleuze and Guattari sense, this is like a work of schizoanalysis. And that's the reason I had to do this, is because I saw these other reviews and this too big to fail. Oh, Peterson's released his new book, and it just ends up, there's reviews in The Guardian, there's people who are saying it's profound. They're saying it's profound much like in the way that many directors now film films, and they'll film it and they'll go, this is what an epic shot would look like. This is a book that is already assumed to be some profound testament from the new intellectuals. It's, and so the reviews come in with that in mind, and then when it actually turns out to be what it is, which is largely gibberish, they have to beat around the bush and call it maybe a bit wordy or whatever it might be. And I just can't really stand for that insincere approach to what is a garbled, very boring, and ultimately just nostalgic mess that equally mutates and bastardizes and waters down to a degree where they're indiscernible figures such as Nietzsche and Jung, who I love. So, the annoyance is, go read something good. right? And this holds the place it does when I've personally met, and I've also personally met so many great scholars, and I've known so many people who are also producing stuff like mine from all across the philosophical and political spectrum, that this is often rises as the cream of the crop, but largely because it's too big to fail, and that's why. And it's the equivalent of like a celebrity comment on something, and really nothing more. And I do stand by what I said. I really do stand by what I said. That I am astounded. I'm genuinely astounded that 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 it. I can only assume there was no editor. That's all I can say. And I'm really, really trying not to be cruel, but I can't stand Emperor's New Clothes approach to this. Um, you know, this is philosophy is a deep love of mine, and this is lazy. That's ultimately what this is lazy, and um, I just can't stand it. I can't stand laziness in that sense. Just don't engage. You don't have to engage with it. You don't have to engage with philosophy. And yeah, there you go. So Jordan Peterson, postmodernist, Derridian, and post-Heideggerian. Um, anyway, I hope you enjoyed listening to my my We Who Wrestle with God review. Yeah, thanks very much.